I want to talk this morning about ecstasis. Now, you're all caught up on your Greek lessons, right? Ecstasis. Do you know what ecstasis means? It's the Greek word from which we get our word ecstasy. It means to stand outside of the normal, outside of the things that keep us comfortable, outside our orientations, outside of our frame of reference, outside of ourselves. Ecstasis. For many, the ecstasis is that mystic moment of revelation, which is an encounter with the mysterium tremendum. That's Latin. It comes from William James. It is that encounter with God. When you really encounter God, you shake. It's fear and trembling. We forget, it comes Sunday, it's nice, we have some cookies, we go home. We weren't fearing and shaking. But when you meet God, you do. This is the fear of God, which is the human response to the transcendent. Now, we all have these moments. I am totally convinced after some 66 years on this planet. And some of those ecstatic moments are good, and some of them really shake us up, and they are bad. Sometimes we experience that wonder and that awe when we see our children or our grandchildren born. But we're also frightened by the fact that our grandparents die. Loved ones slip away from us. From a brush with death to the mountaintop, when they're standing on the shore, wonder, awe, and ecstasy are the product of the encounter with God and ultimately produce our faith. Now, some churches produce an easy ecstasy every week. They get people up there and dancing and shaking and raising their hands and stuff. Then they come back for the next edition on the following week. But there was this guy, his name was Amos Wilder. He was a professor of Old Testament at Harvard many years ago. He said the real proof of the mystic ecstasy is in the consequent behavior of the one who was ecstatic. And that's where the sermon is going. What happens when we do have an ecstasy? What happens if we don't? Peter's experience in that boat was an ecstasy. He experienced ecstasis in the most profound way that a human could as he stepped beyond the gunwales onto that scary surface of a raging sea. It was an experience that was so profound, it was even shared by the disciples. And they became ecstatic, and at the end of this experience, they said, surely this man is the Son of God. They had encountered God in the way that they could understand. This story, though, is more than an account of a boat ride. It's an encounter with the divine on the journey of life, through the storms of life. And we all have those storms. You see them on the news every morning. Now, some scholars would interpret this as a resurrection appearance, which we read this morning appropriately because it's Easter in the Orthodox world today. Happy Easter, Orthodox people. But in this story, I believe the real key, I believe that there is a real key to finding a sustainable faith. We hear that word sustainable these days bandied about: sustainable agriculture, sustainable economies, sustainable environments. The summary interpretation of the story: while following Jesus and experiencing the difficult challenges of life, when one reaches the absolute limits of human experience and capability, like Job, in the midst of the storm, a divine presence that lifts and directs and ultimately calms and finally sustains us. I recently, about 11, 12 months ago, experienced an ecstasis. Not nearly so dramatic as the story this morning, but I stepped out of the professional ministry. I retired. I stepped out. After 39 years, I got out of the boat. Now, about a year or so into this, I'm beginning again to reflect on my own spiritual journey. Because now there seems to have been a reversal in my personal focus. I'm not looking to help others as much now as I am looking to fulfill my own needs. You don't hear pastors talk about this too often. But here, it's my struggles rather than the people's and the building and the budget and, all that other stuff that we've talked about for a while. But it has given me this chance to step away and step into other churches, to look at them from the outside. Not as a to-do list of things I am responsible, but as we might say these days, a consumer of religious experiences and products. Ooh. The question, and now we ask this mostly in fun, but has a little edge to it. Will you still go to church after they quit paying you to do this? Well, there's some honesty here, folks, going on. I think a lot of pastors don't because they're terribly burned out. Just the responsibilities of maintaining the institution and the great emotional burden of caring for people just does a job on pastors. That's why they need a day off. But I found within my own life that there was this ongoing emotional fatigue from the pastoral responsibilities, and eventually that became a burden from which I wanted to free myself. For we see folks, when we stand here in the pulpit, not just as those happy faces on Sunday morning, but we see those people as lives displayed with their ups and their downs, their health and their sickness, their fractured relationships and their new ones. Lives filled with storms and a sense of being overwhelmed. But the answer is, yeah, I still go to church. Sometimes they pay me now, but most of the time I don't. I just sit there. Old habits are hard to die. So I began to visit, other churches, and I've now had a chance to see, 6, 7, 8, 9, something like that. But I also stand outside of the church and in my responsibilities as a professor, an adjunct professor at Roger Williams, I talk to young people. And I ask them in my class, how many of you are religious? Maybe one person holds their hand up. How many of you are political? Because I teach democracy. Nobody holds their hand up. How many of you own an Apple product? Yeah, we all got Apple products. Who controls your life? I began to teach and play music with some non-church people. That's a whole nother world out there, folks. They look at us like, those crazy old people, what are they still doing that for? I also discovered that you get more respect, more social respect as an adjunct professor than you do as the pastor of an historical church. Yeah. We struggle with this. Anyway, most people out there these days don't see church as necessary. They say, well, we're not religious anymore, we're spiritual. And I go, well, how do you practice that spirituality? Well, I stay in bed on Sunday. Never mind. But people see the church as judgmental. Worse, they see it as hypocritical and exclusive. You have to be like us to be a part of it. And now, like I used to hear the older people say, now that I am one, what a world. The world around us has changed considerably since I came to awareness. My faith is not the same as it was when I was 27, or even as it was 18 months ago. I'm looking back now across 66 years, and my life has had its storms. I look at the churches now and I ask myself, would I join that one or that one? Which one of those can meet my spiritual needs? Can any of them? And I find that 2/3 of the way through this earthly life, I still search for a sustainable faith. One that sustains me personally, but also one that will sustain the church as we have grown into and through it, into its future. My second go at seminary when I was doing my doctoral work, I learned about developmental stages of faith. There was the simply religious. That's like a little child looking at a flower, or us standing on the beach and sensing the power of the ocean. Where is something greater than us? But we're a part of it. But then that second phase is the affiliative. I want to be with my people. I want to be with the people who are like me, who believe what I do. And then there is this long stretch of questioning faith where we sort it out. Why this? Why not that? How come? Where did we begin? All those questions. You can't make me think that. And finally, one owns a faith. That's the sustainable level. That's the faith that you can share, that you can walk into the coffee shop or across the soccer field and talk to people with authenticity. But in my ecstasis, I found myself going back to that questioning faith. Not questioning my faith in God so much, for in the storms of my life, I have had great certainties. When I read the psalm that says, "In thee there is no darkness. Darkness is as light with thee," I can get through difficult moments. And when Micah says, "What does the Lord require of me?" He keeps it simple for us. Practice kindness, do justice, and walk humbly with God. That part I can do. But can the church survive? Is there a sustainable faith that we can all share? If people no longer find ecstasy in our well-ordered worship, where will they find it? When I left the settled pastoral ministry, I engaged with a church very much like yours. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. When I left the settled ministry, I left a church that was, as you all folks know now, is not only similar to yours in size and history, but shares many, many of these points. As I drove down this morning, I'm going, yeah, that's where we started, and that's, you know, and they came up that way, and you know, it's like a trip through history. But the church that I just left, the Swansea Baptists, is facing the same kind of problems that you folks have. And we have already had some formal conversations, but they come up again for me. Emerging out of this new perspective of standing outside of the church. What would people have to do to persuade others out there who think of church as unnecessary, the 70 or 80% of people who no longer say, I participate in anything organized religion does, what would it take to get them in here? To become interested again in the fellowship and the life that we have? Can we who are still responsible for growing and sustaining congregations describe the faith or even the spirituality or the religious beliefs or practices of those who don't participate? What do they really think about us in here? Do they simply see us as irrelevant because we tell ancient stories, which they consider myths and fairy tales? Do they consider us a place of sustaining support? A community of compassionate trust? Do they see us as a community which inculcates and engenders both meaning and purpose for their lives? We do, of course. But do they? If we were called upon to share our faith with a 16-year-old on a skateboard, do you have the words? Do you have the right phrasing that'll catch such a person's interest? What about a young professional who is working 80 hours a week and has kids that got to go to soccer? What do we say to them to convince them that the church should be a part of that journey? My ecstasis has left me with many questions. Where did the faith of all those people who used to come, where did that go? Just evaporated? Whatever the church has been doing in the old days, it ain't working anymore. It did not sustain their faith. Why doesn't the church now become that boat into which Jesus directs us so that we can get through our storms? What boats do all those people out there get into? The ferry to Block Island? Their little sailboat for Sunday afternoon? Maybe they go to the softball team or band practice, or maybe they just stay in bed. Well, and then there's a Patriots Celtics Sox thing, but no. Obadiah Holmes, person that our two congregations share in our history. He had an ecstasis. He probably had many. But after a dust-up in 1650 with the pastor of the Newman Congregational Church, still there in Rehoboth, he went to Newport. But then he left behind a people who formed our congregation and eventually gave birth to yours. While John Clark was in England and Obadiah was in Newport being their pastor, John Clark brought back, as we're celebrating this year, the Rhode Island Charter of 1663. But here is what Obadiah was preaching to his congregation. Try what you hear, whether it be according to the truth. Take nothing from any man until you have tried it and well digested it by good understanding. Often examine yourselves and lean not to other men's judgments. Beware of falls. Endeavor and see that your evidence be good, which is alone the Spirit of God, with your own spirit according to the Scriptures. Be much in holy meditation. Read the Scriptures carefully. Beware of neglecting or slighting any ordinance of Christ. Remember his death often, as we will in a moment, and take heed lest you make an idol of men or ordinances. Our Baptist faith was founded in such ferment, in search of a real faith, in search of a sustaining and sustainable faith. Yet this ferment is the product of living through storms in which we may experience God, where we may experience the mysterium tremendum. Holmes was preaching against pedobaptism when he was arrested, taken to the Boston Common, and whipped unmercifully. Then he came to share the consequence of that ecstasis with the people of Newport as their pastor. The courage and the commitment and faith needed to be a Baptist back then makes our modern commitment really seem pretty sketchy. How do we become ecstatic? How do we reclaim a church that persuasively can proclaim a sustaining and sustainable faith? Well, it's really popular these days. Everybody says, well, you got to think outside the box. Most attempts don't succeed because when they think they're outside the box, they aren't. Because when you're outside the box, like being outside the boat, it gets pretty sketchy. It gets pretty crazy. You know, the things aren't the way that you thought they were going to be, and you get to be afraid. The box is the comfort zone that keeps us from the encounter with God. To really find the wind, the ruach, the very Spirit of God's engine of change, the power to create, when you are really in the wind, the very movement of God, you have to put yourselves in that scary place, without protection, without assurance, and without any guarantees. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried, "Lord, save me." If Jesus asked us to go ahead, to get into the boat, we'd probably go, "Let's check the weather forecast." Any chance out there of storms? Maybe tomorrow we can go across, Jesus. Jesus, the sailing isn't good today. Can we just stay here and eat the leftovers? No. Get in the boat. Our story today should warn us about such a situation that if we do not follow Jesus, the real stuff, into the real stuff of life, into disease and disaster, politics and religious squabbles, because we know we're going to be terrified by all of that, and we'll be in trouble, and we'll be in danger of even losing our lives, maybe even the church itself. So the real point of the sermon today is very simple. If we are not following Jesus unquestioningly by placing ourselves in the terror of the storms, we're not talking Irene or Sandy here, or the blizzard of 13. When we are actually out there in the storms of life, we cannot protect ourselves. If we do, we actually miss the opportunity to see God's Spirit, the Ruach, the wind. Awe-inspired and inspiring faith, ecstatic faith, sustaining faith emerges out of crises, out of ecstasies, good and bad. Such a faith certainly begins with questioning, but it ends when we take somebody else for a scary boat ride and about halfway across the lake say, "Get out of the boat." Amen.